going to kick things off. This is only a 45-minute webinar, so we want to get started. I'm also going to take myself off. I don't actually know how to take myself off the camera because we had a little issue with the hot water this morning, so I didn't wash my hair, so I'm kind of self-conscious. All right, so it's how to read and write a valid RFP for employee behavior change programs. That covers the gamut of all programs that involve wellness, diabetes, point solutions, and disease management, and we will give examples from all of them. Those of you who are familiar with me personally know that I've written or co-written 2 books on this subject, and in addition, a number of other publications have highlighted the metrics that you're going to see today. Everything from the Wall Street Journal down to most recently a case study in Harvard Business School case study that compared our metrics to metrics that dramatically overstate savings. So before we get into this and show all the things that are not doing well, I do want to highlight an honor roll of valid vendors and well-versed advisors. First, there are vendors who are validated at a high level by the Validation Institute. Examples would be US Preventive Medicine and Wellness, Verta and Cecilia in diabetes, Seraph Prognostics in high-risk maternity, and Quantum Health in care navigation. And second, there are also firms where many consultants and affiliates have achieved critical outcomes report analysis certification from the Validation Institute, and hence are able to write solid RFPs on behalf of their customers. And those with the highest of degrees of affiliation would be Alera Group and Health Rosetta. And basically, anybody on this webinar, you wouldn't be here if you weren't serious about valid RFPs. And let us not forget Quizzify on the honor roll. We can't be writing books and doing webinars about mismeasurement and not measuring validly ourselves. And we will actually show you briefly. We don't get RFPs because we're the only company in the field, but because it's hard to do. It's like writing a novel, trying to make these things creative. But you will see how a real ROI measurement tool actually works, validated by the Validation Institute, I might add. So let's start out with a polling question. And the question is, how many people think their current RFPs that they read or write procure bids that are generally quite valid, somewhat valid, or largely invalid? And while you're doing that, I'm going to give a little plug for Quizzify. It's easy for us to measure validly because we're teaching people basically to avoid the massive amount of overutilization that takes place in this country and that is hard for them. We teach that just because it's healthcare doesn't mean it's good for you. So the savings tend to take place right away. Now we also educate people on lifestyle, diabetes, et cetera. But where the money is not demanding things that aren't good for you. All righty, so Mark, do we have a, yes, somewhat valid. Okay, so we're going to re-ask this question at the end and see if there is a change. So first, we're going to show you how vendors, not the ones on this call, put their fingers on the scale through regression to the mean and a couple other things, starting with regression to the mean. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's the tendency of samples to become less extreme as sample size increases. Example is the baseball standings, and I'm using April 28th, 1988, because the Baltimore Orioles very famously lost, they almost went 0 for April. They lost their first 21 games. So there's a humongous difference between the first and the last place teams. Over the course of the season, this regresses to the mean. So the range between the first and the last goes from 0.762 to 0.216. The other thing to notice about this particular season, and this is true in regression to the mean as well, is that the teams that were the lowest at the end of April, with the exception of Baltimore, which actually dramatically improved in a relative sense, these two teams ended up high And a lot of these teams ended up low. So over time, the higher ones generally decline and the lower ones generally increase. What is true in baseball is true in RFPs and ROI measurement. And many vendors have weaponized regression to the mean. And here's an example from a carrier proposal that we're not going to name. They guarantee that 30% of the worst vendors will, of the worst members, employees, will improve their risk scores. They will go from high or medium risk to medium or low risk, 30% of them. Now, they don't say anything about the low risk people going up in risk. It's just this, nothing about that. And if you use this methodology, and let's take the example of smoking cessation. Let's assume that everyone in your organization smokes and quits in alternate years, and that smoking is the only risk factor. So basically 50% of your organization is smoking every year, but it's a different 50%. If you only measure, and it's the only risk factor, if you only measure people going down, you're going to basically take credit for all the smokers who quit, but you're not even going to acknowledge that there are quitters who start smoking again. So every year you're going to find 100% reduction in the smoking rate, even though the smoking rate remains unchanged. Now, another polling question, and actually I think I saw a Q&A thing going on in here. Do you think the omission in this brochure is an honest mistake or a deliberate fabrication? And while we're doing that, Mark, what is the question? Mark?
Sorry, I was muted there. Is it ever valid to look for people to look? Is it ever valid to look at people who are already identified with a disease or risk factors or high cost?
That group will always decline, just like you saw in that chart. If you want to make that valid, what you can do is go back to some dummy years where you didn't have the program and say, let's look at all the people who had a heart attack, and let's see what happens to their utilization or their cost the following year. Or let's see how many people went to the emergency room, and let's see what happened to their emergency room visits the next year. And then what you do is you tease that part out. So a perfect example would be if it's like flipping coins. If you start out with all heads, you're going to get a 50% reduction. So that's the amount you start with. And if a vendor promises you a 60% reduction, I'm very impressed. So you just have to tease out. If you're starting just with people who are high risk or high cost, you have to tease them out. You have to tease out the initial amount that's at stake. So Mark, what do we have here? Well, we have a lot of people who I think are going to be a little surprised at this answer. The answer is that the way we know that their guarantee is a deliberate fabrication is that 2/3 of this population is low risk, but they put those 2/3 into 1/3 of the bar, so nobody would notice that in fact 2/3 of them are low risk. And the way they justify that arithmetically is each little bubble there represents 10 people. So this was a very creative deliberate fabrication. So we're going to do this is going to be a little bit tougher of a polling question, but I think it's a very important one. Which of the following vendor RFP claims is not polluted by regression to the mean? The most obese employees lost 20 pounds. We get a reduction of 1% in participants with high HbA1cs. The total percent of employees with high HbA1cs will fall by 20%, or the percent of high-risk employees improving will exceed the percent of low-risk employees getting worse. And we have at least one more question in the Q&A. So what do you have for us?
Isn't most of the case management savings regression to the mean?
Yes, it is. And it's also participation bias because a lot of people don't join. And once again, the way you would tease that out is not unlike what we saw before. And I didn't give the example case management, so thanks for bringing that up. The people get case management because they have major events, And if you take the whole subset of people who have major events and trend them forward a year, well, you're not going to have another transplant next year. You're not going to have another bypass next year. So those numbers are going to fall dramatically. To tease out your case management savings, you've got to tease out that amount first. So Mark, do we have? Okay, so the percent of high-risk employees improving will exceed the percent of low-risk employees deteriorating 1. And in fact, that is actually incorrect. The answer is the percent of employees with high HbA1cs will fall by 20% because you're taking essentially every employee in the organization, not just the high ones that went down. You'd be looking cross-sectionally at every employee. And let's say you had 1,000 employees. This would say instead of having, I don't know, 10 over, over 9 HbA1c, you would have 8. Period, across the whole organization. Anybody who participates, anybody who gets screened, not participates in the program, but anybody who gets screened in those years. Now, I had a feeling that people were going to say that last one, which is the percent of high-risk employees improving will percent of low-risk employees deteriorate. And I have to admit, the first time I saw that, it was from a carrier that I think is kind of sketchy. So it looked okay to me too, and then I looked hard at it and realized it was just the cleverest deceit that I've ever seen from a carrier. Because note, they said percent of employees improving and percent of high-risk, low-risk employees getting worse. Because there are so many fewer high-risk employees, you could, for instance, have 10% of the 670 get worse, and you'd have 667 people getting worse, while 20% of the high-risk people got better, and that's only 26%. So you would have to replace those percent signs in the title here with numbers in order for it to be valid, and guess what? They don't do that. Participation bias. Now, if you only take away one thing from this webinar, it's that participants will always outperform non-participants, period. There is no question about that. And here is the sort of the smoking gun graph that proves it. Well, first, you should start your y-axis at 0, but in the case of the wellness industry, that's not even a misdemeanor. They separated the population. This, by the way, was not some ordinary slide. This was an award-winning slide from a wellness award-winning company that was shown many, many times. They separated the participants and the non-participants. The participants went up much more slowly than the non-participants. The vendor said, well, this is because the program was so good. But if the smoking gun is, if you look carefully at this slide, you will find that, in fact, what they call the treatment, the wellness program, did not start for 2 years after the people were separated. And during those 2 years, the participants dramatically outperformed the non-participants in terms of having the much lower costs. And the Wellness Industry Trade Association tried to walk this one back, but I had all the screenshots. There was nothing they could do about it. You did note that, you may note that, in fact, this number expanded quite a bit. If you peel the onion and you look back at the data that they presented, there's essentially no change in risk factors that could have explained that. So now, similar question, except this time it's about participation bias and not about regression to the mean. Which of the following RFP claims is significantly polluted by participation bias? We get a 1% reduction in participants with HbA1cs over 8. We reduce the percent of employees with high HbA1cs. The third one that we had before, or all of the above. And if I'm looking up here correctly, another question.
What if a vendor says they shouldn't be responsible for non-participants?
Well, that's what they say. But the thing is, they should get enough of a reduction in participants to move the entire needle. So, for instance, let's say you have a diabetes program, to use the same example that we use, and let's say you only get, and let's say that in the entire population, 1% of people 10 out of 1,000 had HbA1cs over 8, actually probably be over 9. If you're the vendor, maybe you can only get 4 or 5 of those people to participate, but of those 4 or 5, you should be able to get enough of a reduction to make up for the fact that you can't reach the others. And also, as a vendor, it's your job to get people to participate. So that excuse does not hold water. So what do we have here, Mark, for the answer? Okay, all of the above. That's always the default answer for everything. Actually, the answer that a few people did get is anytime you see the word participants, it is invalid. We get a reduction of 1% in participants with HbA1cs over 8. Newsflash, you could do nothing except ask them if they want to participate, and you will get that result. This one somebody just sent in this morning. I won't say the name of the company, but it's not validated by the Validation Institute in diabetes like Berta and Cecilia are. 94% of participants defined as having a quote unquote critically high HbA1c were able to decrease their HbA1c to under 8. So now you've got regression of the mean and you've got participation bias in there. Now, versus trend. Anytime you see the word versus, 2 words, versus trend, throw it out. Here's an example. We did white out the names of a company that claimed to get dramatic reduction versus trend. They had terrific PR. It was a big study. It was all over the place. And most of the people who saw it just basically accepted it on its face and put out rather, in retrospect, what rather embarrassing articles about it. What these folks did was they got actuaries. They said, well, we retained actuaries, independent actuaries to do this. And here's another thing you got to take away from this, which is that vendors do not retain actuaries to validate savings. They retain actuaries to fabricate savings. If they were really valid, they just go to the Validation Institute. Have you ever seen an actuarial report that said, so-and-so hired us to find savings and there weren't any? No, of course not. The actuaries would lose their job. So they basically just picked a bunch of clients and threw in a control line, and then they were able to show savings versus trend. So the question is, how do you know they were making this up? Well, there were 5 comorbidity groups from 0 to 4 plus. This first group here, which is where 2/3 of the people were, had absolutely no reason to call this company, would not have benefited from it if they had, because their costs were so low. And yet somehow were able to save 8%, even though they didn't use the service. Now, what's more interesting is let's look at all of these comorbidity groups as a group, 0 through 4 plus, and what they call the cost ratio, meaning the change in cost goes from here to here with an average of 8.3%. And one is reminded of the immortal words of the great philosopher Sherlock Holmes, Watson, you see, but you do not observe. So let us observe. We'll take these numbers on the right, what they call the cost ratio. We'll graph them up, 0 through 4. Then let's take the top 3, which has about 15% of the population in it, and combine them into 2 or more. So we get the yellow. Let's now do the same thing for the people who basically had nothing wrong with them and no reason to call this particular vendor. And guess what? The difference in savings completely goes away. There is none. All they did was just take a trend line and compare to it. Now, the Quizzify ROI Calculator, just for the record, does not do, in fact, there's something wrong with this link, so I'm going to go right to here. Just for the record, does not do any of this. If you go to the Quizzify ROI Calculator, you will see that every single one of these areas where what we would call the low-hanging fruit, where Quizzify is finding the savings, is based on the entire population, not participants, and it includes people who had no, recognizable. We don't even need, recognizable claims in the first place. It is a simple reduction in utilization of the, stents, fillings, all sorts of stuff that we'll be discussing in our next webinar. And in the case of ER billing, we actually reduced the price quite a bit. Also, unlike every other ROI model and every other vendor, you can change the assumptions in all these things. You can change the starting assumptions, the price, the utilization, whatever you want to do. That's called validity, my friends. So let's go back to the presentation. And now let's show how you guard against these things. So this RFP was put out by the Commonwealth of Virginia. It said, describe any guaranteed improvements in financial outcomes and the amount of fees at risk for each year of the contract. You must, capitals are there, there's, include a description of the ROI methodology. Well, despite the caps, Virginia was just begging to be snookered, because here's the thing. You don't, hang on, I got closed captions on. You don't ask vendors how to measure ROI, yet tell them how you're measuring it and make them measure it the same way. So you're going to tell them exactly what variables you're measuring, what your starting points are as an organization. Even if you don't know, you can guess and adjust later. Then you have them bid specific prices for specific endpoints with specific levels of risk. And at the end, you would have a Validation Institute baseball type arbitration clause. So there's no argument after the fact. Now let's go through how you would list variables for this sample RFP. And we're going to show you examples from wellness or disease management. And by the way, you can't separate the two. If you're looking at outcomes and your number of heart attacks goes down, you don't know if it was because of your wellness program or your disease management program. So they have to go together, or it could have just been luck. And then we'll do diabetes, and the diabetes is kind of an example of other point solutions. And then we'll adjust for smaller organizations and organizations that can't get their claims data, and then we'll show you the arbitration clause. So the first thing you do, this is now common chronic disease. You measure the specific ICD-10 codes, primary codes that go with each of these diseases. So for instance, in asthma, it's just the primary code of J45. If you have an asthma attack, you go to the ER for asthma attack, they code it J45. Diabetes has a whole lot of permutations, but one way or the other, if someone has something like diabetes or a simple complication of diabetes, this would be their primary codes. So then you take these codes and you're gonna, the first thing you're gonna do is you have to make sure these things are, the reason you use these codes is you wanna make sure that they are, your results that you're asking for are caused by the program. And we'll show you some examples of those first. So here's what we mean. At the very minimum, that be linked to the program. And this is an example. This came out of a published study by some wellness, well-regarded wellness people. Among the highest quartile participation, medical costs decreased significantly, ... and for blood and blood-forming organs. Now you tell me how taking more steps and eating more broccoli is going to cause the following diseases to go down. Cider, I don't even can pronounce most of these things. And the most common blood or blood-forming disease, if you're a Ted Nugent fan, you know, is cat scratch fever. So they managed to reduce all of these things by the simple expedient of not following the rules that we would put out, which say that it has to be linked. What you measure has to be linked to what the program is accomplishing. The other things for the valid RFPs, it has to be units of utilization unless it's total cost, because the vendor can't control pricing. Now, if like Quizzify, you are in fact pitching a cost reduction in the emergency room costs, where we guarantee every emergency room visit for anything at any ER will be under $1,000, then you look at cost. Otherwise, if you're doing wellness, point solution, whatever, you're looking at units of utilization. As mentioned, if a vendor puts cost versus trend, you toss them. Then you draw a bright line between bad units, hospital and ER, and good units, preventive visits and preventive drugs, which should go on. Your RFP is looking for reductions in the bad things, and you expect to see an increase in the good things. And we have an example from Quantum Health in Why Nobody Believes in Numbers, which is one of my books, where we did what we would call a plausibility check on their savings, where we found that even though they saved money overall, the quote unquote good things, the preventive things like primary care visits and program participation went way up. And it was the things that you would expect to go down that went down. So that's what you're looking for. You're looking for the bad units to go down. So here is a sample set of assumptions of these bad units pre-pandemic of ER and inpatient rates per 1,000. So this is the starting point, which you put in the RFP, and you say to the vendor, you have to improve from these starting points, whichever ones they're doing. So for instance, in asthma, if you had 10,000 people and 3.7 per 1,000 were going to the hospital, the ER, that would be 370 folks who did that. Is that right? Yeah. No, I'm sorry, per 1,000, that would be 37 folks, not 370. So these are the starting points. Then you say to the vendor, we want you to bid specific prices for specific endpoints with specific levels of risk. And all you need is one chart. You don't need anything that's complex. The complexity will just make it less valid. You ask, what will be the annual reduction in these wellness-sensitive ER and inpatient medical events by year 3 or year 2 or whatever you want to do? And you say, these are the percents at risk. These are the reductions. You don't have to bid all of them, but we want you to put some of them in here. Then you simply do a merge of the sheets that come back, and you can put the vendors side by side, and you can see with exactly the same starting points, exactly the same amount of risks, valid measurement, and exactly the same promises, how they stack up against each other. And once again, it's much easier to do that than it is to do some humongously complex RFP. Note that this checks all the boxes. There's no regression to the mean because you're looking at pure events per 1,000. There's no participation bias because everyone is included. And as the first questioner or the second questioner mentioned, vendors will whine, but they have to get enough reduction among participants to reduce overall utilization. No inflation versus trend. So it's all units. Now, there is some COVID era confounding in here that is a little bit more dense, but is very important. So in the COVID era, what you'll find is these event rates, which looked very steady pre-COVID, will wobble quite a bit. So the vendors have to then commit to a difference of differences in inpatient and ER events. So for instance, for diabetes vendors, it would be diabetic versus all other chronic disease. For wellness vendors, it would be cardiometabolic versus all other chronic disease. And we're going to take these things that we showed right here, and we're going to put them in a graph. So between 2016 and 2019, by the way, this is real data from a real organization, of course, the ER and inpatient rates per 1,000 for all of these things stayed fairly constant. You know, for all the talk about diabetes going up, it is going up in prevalence, and it is going up in the elderly in terms of hospitalizations, but the actual number of people going to the ER hospital with diabetes has really not changed in the commercial population until 2020, when the pandemic hit and suddenly everything fell. Even the things you would not expect to fall, like these wellness, what we call wellness sensitive medical events. I mean, you think if someone has to go to the ER, they have to go to the ER. No, they stayed home because they didn't want to get sicker. And the same was true in 2021, where it kind of settled at the same 2020 level. Now, so let's say it's the end of 2021. I'm going to use 2022 as the RFPing example because I can't use it as a baseline because we don't have 2022 data, obviously. So let's say you're doing this in late 2021. How would you do this validly, knowing that these events are going to bounce around? Well, let's look at diabetes as an example of a difference of differences benchmark. Okay, so diabetes vendors may be asked to go at risk, and we use the example of 9% in our little grid. Might be 6, might be 3, whatever. That means that relative to the other common chronic diseases you are not paying extra to manage, diabetes events should decline by 9%. Now, I know someone's going to ask, well, what if your diabetes control gets your reduction in heart attack? You can, instead of using primary coded diabetes, you can use secondary coded diabetes and capture that. I'm just simplifying it as much as possible here. So 2 things could happen if, in fact, you're getting this diabetes bid and you're expecting an outcome, is in 2022, all the other chronic disease events stay at 2021 levels, and that means diabetes has to fall by 9%, or everything else increases back to where it was in 2019, going up 20%, which means diabetes, to improve by 9%, relatively speaking, would only go up by 11%. So I'll show you an example of each. So this one would be if, in fact, everything stays the same in 2022 at a lower level than it was pre-pandemic, diabetes would have to go down 9% in order for the vendor. That would be the promise that the vendor would be making. But the vendor's promise would be relative in this case, so that if everything returns to the 2019 level or something in between, this diabetes line is going to outperform these dotted lines by 9 percentage points. I'm sorry, I mean 9 percentage points or 9%, 9 percentage points. So let's do a couple of adjustments here. One is that looking at the people who've signed up for this, a number of them have come from smaller organizations, and also we hear all the time that people can't get their claims data. So how would you adjust for a smaller organization? Smaller groups, if you try doing this common chronic disease analysis, you will find that your numbers bounce around, because the absolute numbers of people going to the hospital with these particular conditions are so low that there's going to be a lot of white noise year over year. It's a very simple solution. For smaller groups, you simply add all of them together and the bouncing should take care of itself. This is an actual group, I believe they're even on this call, that has validation from the Validation Institute. You can see that their bouncing became very steady when you added everything together. There was a very dramatic reduction in the red line here from during the pandemic. And then it almost stayed the same here. But the important thing to note is that all the bouncing leaves. Now, in this particular this particular group got validation from the Validation Institute because they measured validly, and they also outperformed the national averages, which the Validation Institute keeps track of. But the important thing for this point is that if you're a small organization, you got to add stuff together. Now, if you can't access your claims data, you can go back to this example. The percent of employees with high HbA1cs, or high anything that gets measured every year without having to rely on claims, will fall by 20%, or whatever the number is. So if you do that, and you're measuring cross-sectionally, like everybody still has to do a weigh-in and a screen and whatnot, there are going to be some people who don't participate. And the first time you do it, there are going to be some who don't participate. The second time you do it, you just got to assume that there's not going to be any systemic reason why certain people would participate one year and not the other. You should be able to look cross-sectionally at each of those screenings and find considerably fewer people with high HbA1cs. And by the way, this isn't actually going to save you any money because it takes years and years for high HbA1cs falling to translate into savings, regardless of what you see from vendors who will say, oh yeah, we reduced these HbA1cs from 8 to 7.5, which means that we saved $5,000 a year because people are, with high HbA1cs will have higher utilization than people with low. No, that's not the way it works. It's not something magic, a magic switch inside your body that suddenly you don't, fall and break your leg and go to the hospital because your HbA1c is a little lower. What if you can't access your, I think I was just talking about this. So I mentioned that no money is saved because HbA1cs only have the longest term impact on savings, and only Virta finds short-term savings in diabetes because they have a keto model that reduces the need for insulin, and they can actually very easily show and guarantee and are validated by the Validation Institute that they are able to achieve that. Now, honestly, our solution is just use Quizzify, folks. It's just much easier. We'll be talking about this at a different webinar. So, remembering what the earlier polling was, on how many people think their RFPs procure bids, and somewhat valid one. Mark, while you're putting the poll up, how many, we have at least one or two more questions in.
Yeah, this one came in. Does it change the red flags in reporting if the vendor is only charging on a per participant basis?
Well, first of all, you have to make sure you know exactly how you define a participant. There is one wellness organization that if their coach passed you in the hallway and said, "Hey, how are you doing?" You said, "Fine," that counted as being a participant. So that's thing one. Thing two is it's not so much how they are charging as how they are measuring. In Quizzify, for example, we can charge per participant. We often don't. We usually charge the other way. That's a contractual issue, not a metrics issue. It is a good question, though. Okay, so what do we have here? Okay, so we changed a fair number of minds. Perhaps there are some better RFPs out there than we thought. And I would love to hear separately from the person who thinks their RFP is quite valid. It's probably someone from Alera that's probably accurate there. So let's do one more. Actually, honestly, we can't do this one because we didn't really get into the Quizzify ROI model. We'll do this one on another webinar. Now, I did promise that this would be a 45-minute webinar, and actually finished ahead of the game. And there's things in the chat box. It is often a challenge to reach eligible members when contact information is incomplete or incorrect. That is absolutely accurate, and that is a contractual issue, and that is a logistical issue. What we're talking about here is measuring outcomes. So if you think you're not, as a vendor, you think you're not going to be able to reach enough people, you can't promise an outcome. You can promise that participants might enjoy the program, or that, people, I don't know, you can make a different promise, but you can't promise an outcome. And then somebody wrote, and bless you for this, "This was great. Will you be sharing the recording of the presentation as well as the slides?" Yes, we absolutely will. And
here's one, Al. Why are participant improvements always better than non-participants?
Because it's a mindset. If you ask people, for instance, do you want to run a triathlon? And a bunch of people raise their hands, and then you go back to their claims data and you match those people against people who did not raise their hands, who have similar levels of claims or similar risk factors for that matter. It doesn't matter whether you run the triathlon or not. In a year from now, those people who wanted to run the triathlon will be in better shape than those who just happen to have the same risk factors and didn't run the triathlon. You cannot control for participation bias. And when organizations that do participants versus non-participants get validated by the Validation Institute, there's always a big asterisk that says, we don't know how much of this improvement is due to participation bias. And I think we have time for
another one here. Wellness often drives up claims. How can this be prevented in an RFP?
Very easily, just don't do it. I mean, wellness does drive up claims. The Wellness Trade Association actually did their own research. This is the Wellness Trade Association, mind you. And they found that, in fact, costs do go up considerably when you have a wellness program, because you're sending a lot of people to the doctor who don't need to go, and you're getting a lot of extra tests, a lot of false positives, et cetera. That's why there's only a couple of validated wellness programs at this point, because it's just really, really hard to do without making costs go up. I see that Q&A bar just skyrocketing there, and we do have another 6 minutes. So Mark, what do we got?
What about point solutions other than diabetes?
That's a good question. So you can apply this to essentially any point solution. It works best with diabetes. With mental health, for example, there's absolutely no way of measuring outcomes at all. So you just have to, do it because your employees need access. I mean, there are a lot of mental health issues today. You can do point solutions with orthopedic, musculoskeletal. Those are very popular. There's probably a pony in those piles, and some have gotten validated. But here's the thing about point solutions for musculoskeletal, as we say in Quizzify, 90% of back pain eventually goes away on its own, but 90% of people are convinced at one point or another that they are in the other 10%. So there's going to be a lot of regression to the mean and a lot of participation bias in those point solutions. Now, having said that, Hinge Health and a couple others do have the validation. It has asterisks, but people do speak very highly of these organizations as participants. So I don't want to take anything away from them, just that you need to recognize that thing about the 90%. What else do we have here? We got some other stuff.
There's some questions about a template out. People would like the recording, but also, is there a template someplace that or a checklist of some of the things that someone who's putting an RFP together should or is working with a consultant should pay attention to or can use?
Yeah. So, well, number one, this presentation. Number two, well, since they asked, I will send the. We have a what we call a data extraction template that will extract those exact ICD-10s that we talked about. And for people who ask, I'm not going to be sending out broadly. I will send them that template. It's used by the Validation Institute. It really works. I personally have been using it for 14 years now. And the other thing is that and we'll send the link to this as well. The Validation Institute does have a checklist on its site of things to avoid, basically an expanded version of what you're seeing here. Things to avoid in an RFP. And it does have there is one blog post on how to write an RFP in that series. So we will put the link to that in the follow-up email. And I'm still seeing a bunch, and I do want to be respectful of people's time. So what do we got next, Mark?
Why don't, what's the reason that consultants aren't writing RFPs validly?
That is a really, really good question. I have absolutely no idea. I have a conspiracy theory, which is that, if you come to, I do RFPs on the side, and if you come to me and you ask me for an RFP, I'm charging $15,000. You got to add another zero of that if you're going to a major consulting firm. And if they were to just put together something that's this thin, they couldn't justify that fee. I myself, I have a day job. I run Quizzify. I can't be, writing these hugely complex RFPs. I'll just put this thing together for you, and it's not going to cost that much. And frankly, I'm probably ripping you off for $15,000 because it's much, much easier to do this validly than invalidly. And as much as we answer these things quickly, they seem to pop up faster than we answer them. Oh, I love seeing the Verta kudos. I was on the Verta team, ... I know of a maternal health startup. Oh, that's not really a question. Oh, that's a chat box. No wonder it's not a question. Yes, you will all get a copy of the presentation. There's
another comment here about someone who must work in wellness saying that when working with employers, I never tell them that I'll save them money. In fact, claims will go up as a result of helping people find PCPs and seeking care, thanks to their, to what we put in, DM or HTN. Do you have a comment on that, Al?
Yeah, there are some people who should be going to the doctor more, but I don't mean to take anything away from this questioner, because I'm sure that they are correct, that there are some people who should be going to find more preventive care who are not. But the typical, many wellness programs, I don't know about this one, include you've got to go to the doctor every year. Well, the data is very, very clear that you shouldn't be going to the doctor every year. Maybe 20% of the population should be going every year. 50% are probably like me. I never go to the doctor unless there's something wrong with me, because the data is conclusive, and that a population that goes to the doctor every year will have more things found wrong with them, more drugs given to them, and absolutely no improvement whatsoever versus not going to the doctor in things that really matter. So it's not going to the doctor and doing wellness is not a one size fits all. If you are able to do a wellness program where you can segment the people who really need to go to the doctor in one group and the people who don't in another group, that will be a successful wellness program. And you should get validated for it. If this is what you're doing, I personally will guide you through the validation process. All right, let's just do one more because incredibly, most people
Yeah,
stayed on.
how many companies seeking validation fail?
Well, that's a great question. Only about 5 to 10% fail, but probably 60 to 70% get a lower level of validation than they had hoped for. Okay, so they may go in and say, if it's a care navigation company, they may go and say, well, we save 8%. And we look at it and we might say, well, yeah, but 5 of those percent are simply that thing we show with a trend line, and only 3% is real. So we would validate them for 3%. So it's a good question. It has and we get that question. And I say I'm merely an advisor to the Validation Institute. I can't speak for them directly, but they get that question all the time. And that is the answer. Okie dokie. Well, hey, thanks everybody. Oh, I did promise one other thing, which is we will have this here, which is the arbitration clause. You can use the Validation Institute. A lot of people just use me specifically, but it costs the same and they have the V on them. But that is a way to avoid all sorts of, it's like a baseball arbitration. You put in your best bet and hope for the best. So thank you very much, everybody, for staying with us the whole time. It helps us, only 45 minutes, and I might add the content is good, and we will get some follow-up within the next day. Signing off.